Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Supplemental 12, Grand Dukes of the Center, Part 4, The House of Habsburg, Part 2, AEIOU. Last time, we traced the path of the Habsburgs as they rose from minor counts in Swabia to kings of Germany and dukes of Austria. And this time, we're going to spend some time following the family as they work to maintain and increase their lands, power, and status throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, I hope I'm not giving too much away when I say that this episode will end with another Habsburg king of Germany, Frederick III, but the journey from here to there was a long and winding one, which sees the fortunes of the house rise and fall. So now we have to go back a little bit to the death of King Rudolf I. Rudolf had taken his family to previously unseen heights, and the Habsburg acquisition of Austria was certainly the most important development for the family in a reign full of important developments. Rudolf of Habsburg had initially granted the duchies of Austria and Styria to all his sons, but that arrangement was later changed so that his oldest son, Albert, ended up with full control over the family's new eastern lands, while he and his brothers split the family's hereditary possessions in Swabia. This uneven distribution ended up being Albert's undoing, as we saw last episode, but it also allowed for a more unified approach to the administration of Austria, which was important because at this point the Habsburgs were more or less strangers in the duchy. Albert of Habsburg came to Austria with a host of Swabian courtiers and officers in tow, and tended to pay more attention to his ancestral Swabian lands than his new Austrian ones. But over the generations, this dynamic would shift, and his grandson Rudolf IV would cement Austria as the heart of the House of Habsburg. But speaking of those Swabian lands, Albert's time as head of the House of Habsburg, or HOHOH as one of my history teachers used to say, also saw the formation of the Eternal League of the Force Cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. The Eternal League was a precursor to the Old Swiss Confederacy, which itself was a precursor to modern Switzerland, and the cantons were prompted to form this union in an attempt to secure more rights and freedoms after the death of King Rudolf I. They all had different relationships to the Habsburgs and the Empire. Uri was a free imperial canton, Schwyz was mostly imperial, but the Habsburgs held a lot of land and rights there, and Unterwalden was a Habsburg territory. But they were all threatened by the prospect of the Habsburgs becoming the imperial house, and all wanted the same thing: autonomy and protection from the overreach of their Habsburg lords and/or neighbors. The Eternal League was not necessarily an aggressive anti-Habsburg union, so much as it was an attempt to stop the Habsburgs from meddling in affairs which the cantons deemed internal. However, the Habsburgs were perennial meddlers, and the Habsburgs' enemies often saw the League as a way to needle their rivals. And as more conflicts arose between the Habsburgs and the cantons, the Swiss would go on the offensive more and more. So the Eternal League received recognition and encouragement from Adolf of Nassau during his conflict with Albert of Habsburg, from Henry of Luxembourg in his reign, and then from Ludwig the Bavarian during his conflict with Frederick the Fair. The Eternal League thus routinely found its interests backed by the kings and emperors of Germany, and consequently, the emergence of the Old Swiss Confederacy is a story of the cantons against the Habsburgs, rather than one of the cantons against the Empire. The first major confrontation in this struggle occurred during the Civil War between Ludwig the Bavarian and Frederick the Fair. The alliance between Ludwig and the cantons prompted Frederick's brother Leopold, who was in charge of the family's Swabian lands, to march against the League. But Leopold was ambushed and defeated at the Battle of Mortgarten. The Battle of Mortgarten has been the subject of some myth-making over the centuries, as National Foundation events tend to be, so the battle was not a catastrophic Habsburg defeat with thousands of casualties, as it is sometimes depicted as, But still, Morgarten was certainly a major setback, and Habsburg authority in the region declined notably as a result. Morgarten was also a notable example of early Swiss pike tactics, which we will become very familiar with towards the end of the podcast. And we first hear mention of the famous Swiss halberd in accounts of the battle. The Swiss were said to have descended on the Austrian army as they marched through a long, thin path, hemmed in by a swamp on one side and a cliffside on the other. The Austrian knights were unable to maneuver and were cut down by the Swiss and their halberds. In the aftermath of the Battle of Morgarten, the cantons renewed their alliance, and throughout the 14th century that alliance would expand. Bit by bit, alpine towns, mountain valleys, and cantons joined or allied with the Eternal League. Lucerne, Zug, Glarus, Zurich, and Bern all joined the alliance of the 3 forest cantons, which consequently grew into the alliance of the 8 cantons in the 1350s. Now, I don't want to overstate the unity of the Swiss at this point in their history, and the alliance was a loose collection of partnerships more than it was a tight confederation. But even so, the expansion of this alliance came at the expense of Habsburg power in the region. But even as the Habsburgs were losing ground in the west, they were gaining ground in the east. So now let's return to Austria. While the Habsburgs initially were strangers in Austria, they did make some moves to integrate themselves into the duchy. For example, Albert I had given 2 of his sons the names Frederick and Leopold, in part as a nod to the names of the old Babenberger dukes of Austria. But we won't be focusing on these sons of Albert, as they spent their time doing things like fighting the Swiss and trying to become emperor, which meant that their time in Austria was pretty limited. Frederick and Leopold both died fairly young and without children, so the Habsburg domains passed to their 2 younger brothers, Albert II and Otto. Otto was a bit of a non-entity, but Albert II is worth following, and he was the first Habsburg to really make himself at home in Austria. While prior heads of the House of Habsburg had bounced between their eastern and western domains and had often gone on other expeditions throughout the empire, Albert was to be found in Austria far more than anywhere else. He held court in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna and began building a family mausoleum in the duchy as well. It was while Albert was duke that chroniclers began to use the term Austrian to describe the family, and Albert's administrative reforms put Austria firmly at the center of Habsburg affairs. Under previous HOHOHs, the Habsburgs' Swabian lands had been administered directly by the family, while Austria had been run by governors and proxies. Now that pattern was reversed, and Albert II paid far more attention to Austria than his predecessors had. He reformed the tax system, reorganized and professionalized the law courts, laid down statutes, fostered the development of towns, and standardized the administration of his various eastern territories. Those territories included Austria, of course, as well as the neighboring Duchy of Styria, but also some new acquisitions. Upon the death of Albert's uncle, the sometimes King of Bohemia, Henry of Carinthia, Albert was able to get the Emperor, Ludwig the Bavarian, to enfeoff him with the Duchy of Carinthia and March of Carniola. Albert had reconciled with Ludwig a few years earlier, and was granted these territories in exchange for supporting Ludwig's own attempt to take over Henry's other major territory, the County of Tyrol. And that was not all. Through his own marriage, Albert was able to acquire the Alsatian County of Ferret, which we know will be at the center of some diplomatic headaches between the Habsburgs and Burgundians later on, but also shows that Albert was not totally focused on Austria. So all in all, Albert's time as HOHOH was a period of reorganization and taking stock. The family retreated somewhat from their imperial aspirations, but did manage to expand their Hausmacht, their house's power base, through diplomacy and administrative reform. One of those reforms was a new house rule for the Habsburgs, which various heads of the House of Habsburg would lay down to organize their dynastic affairs from time to time. Albert's rule did not quite implement primogeniture inheritance, but it did attempt to organize the inheritance to keep Austria united from generation to generation. We don't need to get into the details of this plan, as it was never fully implemented, but upon Albert's death, only his oldest son, Rudolf, was of age, and so the Habsburg lands would fully pass to him, at least at first. Rudolf IV was only 19 when his father died, but he had enough energy, ambition, and political talent to make up for his youth. Rudolf came out of the gate swinging with a bombastic response to Emperor Charles IV excluding the Habsburgs from the ranks of the electors of the empire in his Golden Bull of 1356. This exclusion both limited the power of the family, as imperial elections always gave the electors the chance to throw their weight around, and was also a big blow to the prestige of the Habsburgs. Rudolf's answer to the Golden Bull was the Privilegium Maius, or the Major Privilege. The Major Privilege was a collection of documents, some genuine but mostly forgeries, which enumerated the various rights and privileges which Austria had been granted over the years. It was called the Major Privilege to contrast it with the Minor Privilege, a real collection of privileges which Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had granted the Babenberg Dukes of Austria back in the 1100s. In fact, Rudolf removed the imperial seal from the Minor Privilege and transplanted it on to the Major Privilege in an attempt to make it appear genuine, a move which many saw through even at the time. The documents that made up the Major Privilege included a letter from Julius Caesar which asserted that his uncle was to be put in charge of the Eastern land as its feudal lord, and that no weighty matter or suit in the empire be resolved without his knowledge. A letter from Nero that released the people of the Eastern land from paying taxes to the empire and gave them autonomy. A revised version of Frederick Barbarossa's Minor Privilege, which made the Dukes of Austria archdukes, a made-up title which elevated their status to the same level as the electors, and other documents that gave the now Archdukes of Austria additional rights and privileges, such as the right to wear an archducal crown and suzerainty over the bishops of Passau and Salzburg. The letters from Julius Caesar and Nero were immediately seen as fraudulent, and anyone with a passing knowledge of Roman history would have been able to tell, even in the Middle Ages. But many of the other forged documents, while viewed as suspect, were accepted as legitimate at the time. When Rudolf submitted the Major Privilege to the empire, in addition to all his forged documents, he also submitted several actually genuine charters. So it was a bit difficult to tell what was real and what wasn't. I definitely get the impression that Charles IV's reaction to all of this was along the lines of, sure, whatever. The emperor did not add the Habsburgs to the ranks of the electors, but he also didn't try to stop them from adopting the title and stylings of Archduke. The Major Privilege set the stage for a further consolidation of the territories of the House of Habsburg. It stated that the Archduke's authority in Austria was absolute, and laid the foundation for the transformation of the Habsburg domain from a bundle of rights over different lands and peoples into a territorial lordship. So why does a forged charter from the Middle Ages matter to us? The Privilegium Maius is interesting in part because it guided the development of the Habsburg self-image. It built up an illustrious past and position in the empire for Austria, and it tied the Habsburg family to the duchy. It was a declaration that Austria was special, that the Habsburgs were special. Now, these kinds of declarations were certainly not unique, and if the Habsburgs did not go on to reach the heights they did, I likely would not have mentioned the Major Privilege at all in the podcast. But the family did go on to reach some impressive heights, and even when they ruled a fifth of the world, the family was always of Austria, and the importance of the of Austria came in part from the Privilegium Maius. But with that said, a forged charter was not Rudolf IV's only achievement, nor was it his only contribution to the greater glory of the Habsburgs and of Austria. Rudolf rebuilt the Church of St. Stephen in Vienna into a magnificent cathedral, and also founded a university in the city, the third in Central Europe behind Prague and Krakow. For these acts, he earned the epitaph, the Founder. Moreover, Rudolf was an adept politician and diplomat, and he worked tirelessly to build alliances and partnerships throughout the empire and beyond. Another of Rudolf's achievements was the acquisition of Tyrol. Tyrol had been ruled by Henry of Carinthia, and upon his death it fell to his daughter, Margaret. Margaret had been married to a Luxemburger prince, John Henry, but the marriage was an unhappy one, as John Henry was both a useless co-ruler and a poor husband. One day, when he was returning from a hunt, he found the castle locked to him, and in fact, all the castles in Tyrol were locked to him. Margaret had had enough and demanded a divorce. The divorce was approved by Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian, who duly married Margaret to his own son. In the end, Margaret would outlive both husbands and her only child. And once again, the Habsburgs would benefit from another noble house's demise. Rudolf was Margaret's cousin, but he was not her closest relative. Nevertheless, he had entered into her good graces by helping her fend off an invasion from her second husband's family after the death of her son. Margaret agreed to make Tyrol over to Rudolf, and in order to convince the estates of the county to accept the transfer, Rudolf presented them with another forged document, which stated that the arrangement had actually been made years earlier and had been sealed with a solemn and irrevocable oath. Evidently, this worked, as Tyrol, along with its lucrative silver mines, soon became Habsburg, and provided a convenient land bridge between the family's Austrian and Swabian domains. Rudolf achieved all this in just 7 years, as he died at age 25, and control of the Habsburg lands passed to his younger brothers, Albert and Leopold. Now, I wouldn't call Albert or Leopold incompetent, but it was clear that Rudolf had taken more than his fair share out of the family store of political acuity, and the fortunes of the house diminished somewhat under their tenure as joint HOHOHs. The most clear-cut example of this is the division of the Habsburg domains. Despite a provision declaring the Habsburg lands indivisible in Albert II's house rule, and another in the Privilegium Maius, in 1379, after over a decade of sharing power, the brothers figured that they could do so no longer. While the brothers did not have a hostile relationship, years of disagreements had built up, and the breaking point for the two seems to have been the Western Schism, where each brother followed a different pope. In the ensuing division, Albert received Austria itself, while Leopold took the rest: Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, Tyrol, and the family's remaining Swabian lands. So for the next century there were Albertine Habsburgs and Leopoldine Habsburgs, and the story of the family gets increasingly hard to track from here, and even more so when the Leopoldine line splits further into Styrian and Tyrolean lines. Therefore, I'm not going to trace the path of all the individual lines, but rather hit on some highlights before I try and bring it all back together with the return of the Habsburgs to the imperial office. For the most part, whenever we've dealt with Habsburgs so far on the show, they've been members of the Leopoldine line, so let's start there. As Leopold had gained control over the family's Swabian lands, the growing headache of the old Swiss Confederacy was his to deal with. Since we last left the Swiss a little over 10 minutes ago, or 70-ish years if you prefer, the alliance of the 3 cantons had grown to 8. While the membership of the alliance did not grow much more over the following decades, the territories claimed by those members did. And that put the Confederacy at odds with the Habsburgs, and occasionally some battle would be fought or a siege here or there would be attempted. So when Lucerne began to encroach on Habsburg territory, Leopold gathered an army to reassert his control over the towns and valleys of the region. In the resulting Battle of Sempach, Leopold, along with a good deal of his army, was killed, and in the battle's aftermath, Habsburg power in the region basically collapsed. Sempach was another great milestone in the development of the Swiss war machine. The Habsburg force significantly outnumbered the Swiss, but pike tactics, tight formations, and the halberd once again carried the day. Now, Leopold's rule was not only defined by his loss to the Swiss, and he actually had a pretty decent military career before Sempach, which netted the family Trieste as a result of a successful war against Venice, and saw him fend off the French knight Enguerrand de Coucy and a host of free companies. But unfortunately for him, the disaster of Sempach tends to overshadow these wins. After the battle, Leopold's brother Albert tried to salvage the situation and sent another army to face down the Confederacy, but that too was defeated, and the Confederacy continued to expand. Over the next few decades, all of the family's attempts to stem the Swiss tide came to naught, and by 1415, even Castle Habsburg had fallen. Leopold's death left his 4 sons, William, Leopold, Ernst, and Frederick, vying for land and territories. Both William and Leopold died fairly young without children, so Ernst and Frederick were left to carry on the Leopoldine line, which consequently then split into Styrian and Tyrolean lines. Before we blow past the younger Leopold, I do want to note that he was the one to marry Philip the Bold's daughter Catherine, and with his death, his brother Frederick was the one who chased Catherine out of Ferret to take the county for himself. Frederick, known to history as Frederick of the Empty Pockets, lived a somewhat chaotic life. And in addition to his occasional conflicts with Burgundy, he also found himself placed under the imperial ban due to his interference with the Council of Constance. This period of imperial outlawry saw Tyrol defect to his brother Ernst, and the Swiss overrun much of the Habsburgs' remaining Swabian territories. Eventually, Mr. Empty Pockets was able to turn things around and regained control of Tyrol, but Frederick was unable to reverse the Swiss gains. Frederick only had one son, Sigismund, possibly named so in an attempt to appease the emperor of the same name. And while we will be dealing with Sigismund of Austria or Sigismund of Tyrol a good deal more on the show, he won't appear on the scene for a little while longer. Ernst had a bit of an easier time than his brother, in part due to the fact that he did not help an antipope escape from Constance. But he also was a talented administrator in his own right, and he managed to turn his collection of territories, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, into a fairly coherent polity known as Inner Austria. And while his brother was known as of the Empty Pockets, Ernst had a much more flattering epitaph, the Iron. As for posterity, Ernst had 2 sons, Frederick, who we will return to shortly, and Albert, who we will not. So now let's move on to the Albertines. Fortunately for us, Albert III only had one son, Albert IV, who also only had one son, Albert V. So at least this part of the family is pretty easy to keep track of. Moreover, as this side of the family did not have to worry about further dividing their lands and the fighting that usually went along with that division, Albertine Austria tended to be the most cohesive part of the Habsburg domain. The Albertines were certainly involved with the goings-on of the Leopoldines. Members of both branches would act as regents for underaged members of the other, and Albert IV was an occasional participant in the conflicts between his cousins. But generally, this side of the family was more focused on the eastern reaches of the empire. The Albertines tended to ally more closely with the Imperial House of Luxembourg than their cousins did, and in the end, this alliance would prove to be a major boon to the Habsburgs. Albert V was an especially close ally of Emperor Sigismund. He played a major part in Sigismund's long fight against the Hussites in Bohemia, and he married the emperor's only child. This made Albert Sigismund's heir, and after the Luxemburger emperor died, Albert suddenly gained the crowns of Bohemia, Hungary, and Germany. And with Albert's imperial election in 1438, the Habsburg grip on the office began to close. While becoming King of Germany proved to be a relatively straightforward affair, Albert would face some complications both in Bohemia and Hungary. Although he was an able administrator, Albert was quite the religious bigot, even for the time. This would be lucrative for him as he raised money by persecuting the Jewish communities in his lands, but it also made the Hussites in Bohemia wary of him. In the end, these chickens did not have the chance to come home to roost, as Albert died of dysentery less than 2 years into his imperial reign, which made him the second Habsburg king of Bohemia to almost immediately die of dysentery. And while that's not an especially rare occurrence in the Middle Ages, I do think that it's interesting that it happened twice in a row. Elizabeth of Luxembourg was pregnant when Albert passed, and ended up giving birth to a son, Ladislas the Posthumous. Ladislas inherited both the Luxembourg and Albertine patrimonies, making him one of the richest and most powerful lords in Europe. But he was also a baby, so regencies were set up for him in Bohemia, Hungary, and Austria. The young Habsburg prince became quite the pawn to have, and before long a multilateral contest emerged over his tutelage. Initially, though, Ladislas was put under the care of the new head of the House of Habsburg, his second cousin once removed, Frederick, the oldest son of Ernst the Iron, but not everyone was content with that arrangement. Frederick would face many rivals for the guardianship, such as his brother Albert, the influential Cilli family, George Podjebrad in Bohemia, and Jan Hunyadi in Hungary. For the most part, Frederick was content to let the local regencies in Bohemia and Hungary do their own thing, but the HOHOH was determined to use his guardianship over Ladislas to hold power in Austria. This was, by now, a common tradition of the House of Habsburg, by my count happening 5 times in the 50-something years since Sempach, and in fact, Frederick himself had been under the thumb of his uncle for several years as a child. In addition to gaining control of Austria after the death of Albert V, Frederick also found himself elected King of Germany. He did not seek the office, but the electors really couldn't think of a better candidate. But that's not really all that much of a compliment. By now, the imperial office was as much of a burden as it was an opportunity, and honestly it was probably more of a burden which few could afford to bear. Moreover, now the Luxembourgs were gone, and the Wittelsbachs had diluted their family's power through division and infighting even more than the Habsburgs had done. In short, Frederick was the only viable candidate. The Duke of Styria took some time to think over whether or not he even wanted to be King of Germany, but eventually his ambition won out, and we should not be surprised. Frederick's motto was AEIOU, and while we don't know for sure what it stood for, it is often taken as an abbreviation of Austriae est imperare orbi universo, which roughly translates to Austria is the ruler of the world. Or, if you prefer German, the equivalent phrase Alles Erdreich ist Österreich untertan also works. Apologies to any German speakers in the audience, but hey, now you know the pain of the French and Dutch speakers. Frederick's time as King of Germany, and later Holy Roman Emperor, would have its ups and downs, but he had the striking ability to outlast his rivals, and his long reign really set the stage for the centuries of Habsburg dominance in the empire to come. But I'll leave off here for now. Frederick may be reveling in his new title and the guardianship of his cousin, but he faces a plethora of threats on a number of fronts, and while his reign as King of Germany was a long one, it certainly was not a smooth one. One of Frederick's major concerns was an overmighty vassal in the northwestern corner of his empire, Philip the Good. The Duke of Burgundy had a pretty hostile relationship with Emperor Sigismund, and while his relationship with Frederick would generally be better, that's really not saying all that much. And early on in Frederick's reign, the King of Germany and the Duke of Burgundy would find themselves at odds over the fate of the Duchy of Luxembourg. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Merceau, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graf von Helmont, Spencer, Graf von Breda, Craig, Graf von Hoensbroek, Lexi, Comte de Blancmont, Sam, Graf von Mormont, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Blue Sky, and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.